Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
In this episode, we wanted to talk a little bit about a game series that has been running for a very long time. And we don't normally talk about game series or games in particular here, but the Final Fantasy series has a lot of ports, remakes, remasters, and everything going on soon in the near and far future, and I'm sure there'll be more again. So I figure this is a nice time to talk a little bit about our history with the series.
Sure. I mean, and we also talked about it quite a bit when we discussed our favorite JRPGs, as there are many JRPGs in the Final Fantasy line, though things outside of that as well. And I think with the remake of Final Fantasy VII coming out in March of 2020, it is worth talking about this series again, especially the curious habit of not releasing anthologies, but like dual packs and like weird collections of the offshoots like Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana and things like that. You know, we're going to stick to Final Fantasy mostly, but when we're talking about Final Fantasy, you can't not talk about Square and Square Enix, which is the behemoth behind all of those games.
Yeah, very much so. And the interesting thing with trying to stick to just the Final Fantasy series is the fact that in its earlier days, Final Fantasy was used as a name to sell other game series. The Game Boy has 4 Final Fantasy games, and none of them are actually connected to the mainline Final Fantasy series, which is a little difficult to deal with because most of the games aren't direct sequels of each other. But the original Final Fantasy games on Game Boy were Seiken Densetsu, Secret of Mana games.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what Final Fantasy Adventure was.
Yeah, and then also, of course, there's the offshoots of the Final Fantasy series like Final Fantasy Tactics, and there's the Cydia games now, which are fighting games.
Plus Bravely Default
series, and the tons of mobile games that they've released as well, both mobile re-releases of mainstay titles and specifically mobile games. And by the way, if anyone wants to drop into the comments and say that mobile gamers aren't real gamers, you can go fuck yourself.
Oh yeah, actually I just double-checked. I fact-checked myself. Final Fantasy Adventure is the first Seiken Densetsu. The first 3 Final Fantasy Legend games are Saga games.
There you go. But yeah, if you have an issue with mobile gamers being gamers, go to hell. Because, like, if you play video games, you're a gamer. Doesn't matter platform, intensity. Yeah, exactly. So I guess let's start with talking about our favorites in the series. I think that's a good place to start.
Oh yeah.
I have a theory that ours are the same or similar, but like, so for me, Final Fantasy VII is my favorite in the series, as cliche as it is, because it's the first Final Fantasy game I ever played.
Mm-hmm.
The first RPG, turn-based RPG I ever played was Chrono Trigger, and then shortly followed by Final Fantasy VII after that on the PlayStation. And It's remained my favorite Final Fantasy game. The scenery is more modern. It's less like fanciful knights and magic, which I'm more into, like modern aesthetics or even steampunky kind of like pseudo-modern aesthetics are kind of my jam. Mm-hmm. The music was more heavy metal influenced and rock and roll influenced, and the existing band the Black Mages, which is made up of members of the sound team, you know when you hear the full heavy metal versions that that's the way these songs were made for, and that I'm sure the remake will have more of the actual band playing the soundtrack instead of MIDI versions of those songs.
Well, I mean, it was sort of Red Book-ish audio on the original, but yeah, there was a lot more synthesizer and keyboard probably filling in on things.
Right. But yeah, I mean, the story was great. It was a behemoth of a game. There was so much content. The first real sense of loss in that game, which I will avoid because we're in an age where that's considered a spoiler again now, I guess.
Comes right back around.
But like there are heavy amounts of loss. You know, characters die. Big devastating moments have it happen. It was the first very cinematic experience I ever had while playing video games that felt larger than life.
Yeah. And I suppose Final Fantasy VII would be, if I have to pick a favorite, would probably be the easy answer.
Right.
The funny thing for me is I do love the Final Fantasy series a great deal. And there are things that I really enjoy in most of the titles that I go back to and like. And so it's hard to pin down a precise favorite. Because it's, Final Fantasy VII is probably the one I've played the most, the one I know the most intimately, the one I have put the most fan brain headcanons into. But Final Fantasy Tactics for the PS1 is a game I've played several times, and the job class system in that is deep and varied, and one that I really like trying out, whether to do a road less traveled in order to challenge myself, or see just how hard and just how fast I can break the game. Certainly on the PS1 version, there's a couple of glitches that make that nice and easy. But Final Fantasy 1 was my first Final Fantasy, and it's one that holds a special place in my heart, even though it's one that I don't necessarily recommend people go back and play if they haven't played it before.
Right.
I have a lot of good memories of playing 6 with friends, and I dare you to find a better mini game than Triple Triad for Final Fantasy VIII. And I mean, we're just kind of like hitting my greatest hits topic stuff here, but I suppose Final Fantasy VII would be the easy pick one. Yeah, Final Fantasy VII. I enjoyed the materia system. It's a great balance of easy to learn with some depth of complexity.
Yeah.
The characters are very memorable. It was the first game that had that size of an advertising budget. Yeah. So it certainly made a huge splash. It was the first one to reach Europe. That was a main numbered series.
Well, and it was also the first one to break outside of Nintendo. Because for many years, it was a Nintendo exclusive. Sega Genesis didn't have any of the Final Fantasy games. And it wasn't until the difficulty with trying to design for the N64 and the fact that their relationship with Nintendo was strained that they went to the PlayStation.
Absolutely.
And now we're in an age where it's all kind of become kumbaya and they're working with everybody.
Yeah.
But, I think also what's interesting for me is because I started with 7, it was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played, my interactions with the series are a little cockeyed because I got into games, like I only played Final Fantasy 6 for the first time last year and I loved it. I ended up getting stuck and I haven't gone back to it, but I did love what I played. That said, I did play Final Fantasy 1 and 2 many years ago, and I hated them because having started with 7, trying to go back to 1 and 2 is like reading a brand new language that you've not studied at all. Like, there is no connection because 7 is very story-driven. They do some hand-holding with the level-up system. Final Fantasy 1 is not that. It's essentially a digital D&D campaign, and you have to figure it out for yourself.
And it was very important at the time when it came out.
Sure.
It did a lot of things that certainly console RPGs weren't doing. Before Final Fantasy, most of the time when you had a random battle in an RPG, it was first-person-ish.
Yeah.
There was the enemy in front of you, command, or what do you do? Whereas Final Fantasy created this sort of big sideways, the enemies are on this side, the heroes are on this side, which got made fun of in later years, certainly in the PlayStation PS2 era, like, oh, let's all stand here and wait our turn nicely. But when all we had was D&D style combat, or not even, something on the NES or Famicom that allowed you to make your turns and then it all plays out and you see it happen, was practically cinematic for the time.
Yeah.
And something that I enjoy about the Final Fantasy series, one that makes it worth talking about, is the fact that because every game is not a direct sequel,
right,
it allowed Square to try to push what an RPG can be and how an RPG played with each iteration, and not every one of them was successful.
No, definitely not. And also, like, I'm sure most people who are listening probably know this, but the reason Final Fantasy is called Final Fantasy is because the studio thought it was going to be their last game, for sure their last RPG, because they've had financial issues. They'd been struggling, and they were like, all right, well, this is our final chance to try and make something that makes an impact. And and the name stuck, and so they kept it and built on it.
I actually have heard that story is a bit apocryphal.
Oh, really?
Yes. There's probably some truth to it. I think Hironobu Sakaguchi, that was his final game.
Right.
It was sort of, well, if this doesn't work, I can go do this other whatever. They wanted to name the series something with the initials FF. Because it's easy enough to say the F in Japanese versus English. And they originally wanted to call it Fighting Fantasy. But there was a series of game books in America. There was a game, like a tabletop game company called Fighting Fantasy. That was like, you can't name your weird video game after our very successful, sure to be remembered forever game company. So now we get the the increasingly absurdly named Final Fantasy.
Yeah, which has 15 installments of Final Fantasies.
Mainline installments, not even spin-off games of those, not even side series.
And sequels, which, like, I remember when there was a sequel for Final Fantasy X, it was unheard of. How dare you? Meanwhile, so many games have had sequels now in their series. 13 had a sequel. There was a sequel to Zodiac Age that was a Game Boy game, I think a DS game.
DS game, Revenant Wings.
So, like, I think even that now is not even a taboo for the series. You know, it's become fairly common. And I mean, even Final Fantasy VII had a prequel, Crisis Core, which was phenomenal.
Yes.
You know, I think what's interesting for me about the Final Fantasy series is that I don't have the longevity that a lot of other fans do. And it's why what I like and dislike about the series, I think, is different than other people who like it. Like, for example, when I was an idiot teenager, when Final Fantasy VII had come out, when 8 came out afterwards, which also had a modern setting, I was super excited for it. It's like, it's going to be more of the same thing because I have zero experience with this series except this one game. So
most didn't.
Right. And so it was going to be like, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be great. And then we got 8, which I am very vocally not a fan of. But, you know, I think my biggest complaint is the draw system. I hated the way Magic worked. It was just so the opposite of what I was used to. I may revisit it when the re-release comes out. We'll see. But that said, because of that experience, and then also, like I said, I was an ignorant teenager. When 9 was announced and they had these chibi characters, it was more fantasy based. It was, you know, knights and mages and clerics. I was like, ugh, kiddie game. I don't want to play this thing. And so because of that idiocy, the same idiocy that had me skip out on Wind Waker because of the graphics, I missed a really great game, which I'm now playing and on the Switch, and I've said many times on the show, I'm really enjoying. But I will say I'm struggling to stay with and finish, not because it's not well made, but just because of the pacing, because it's a PlayStation 1 game. It's paced in a very different way than modern RPGs are paced.
Yes, they are. And even Final Fantasy IX was paced a little differently than PlayStation games were at the time. Final Fantasy IX was a big love letter to the series as a whole.
Correct.
With certain outfits and characters being references to previous job classes.
Yep.
Character names being retreads. I mean, Princess Sarah is in both Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy IX, when you dig deep enough. And this actually wasn't even the first time Final Fantasy had done that. Final Fantasy V is also another case of Square, at the time Squaresoft, going, well, let's pull in a bunch of elements here, but unlike 9, in 5 they went, let's not be too serious with this whole thing. It is still a serious enough story, but a lot of the elements and a lot of the pieces, there was a little bit of a send-up, or they played things very straight and very close, just as sort of a joke and almost sarcastically, if one wanted to interpret it that way. And 9 with a lighter tone than 7 and 8, which were both infamously grim.
Yeah.
Or emo, or edgy, or whatever word you would like to use to describe it based on how you feel about the game. 9 was considerably more lighthearted.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about 9 for me, though, is that some of it still hasn't aged well. And I had a chat with this. Danger Doll has been Twitch streaming Final Fantasy IX. And so I jumped into her chat and to talk with her a bit. And I mentioned the only thing that hasn't aged well for the game that I hit a hard wall with every time it happens is Zidane's womanizing. And now it's still not as blatant as some other things in other games, but like he's clearly a bit of a chauvinist and a hound dog. But that said, most of the women do shut him down or smack him or like he gets reprimanded.
Yeah, he doesn't get away with it. And there's even points where he tries to improve himself.
Right.
But it doesn't always necessarily take either the other person doesn't believe him or it's not good enough.
Right. And so from a dialogue perspective, that kind of gets old fast. But the good thing is he is a character that grows, like you said. And so later on, the evolutions become really interesting. You know, all of the characters have some great growth, you know, and so going from 9 for me then to 10, the first of the Final Fantasies on PS2, like the graphical upgrade, the fully voice acted cast was a recipe for both growth and disaster.
Yes.
Because having a fully voice acted game, now I'm replaying it on Steam right now. I'm maybe 12 hours in and I'm enjoying it. the voice acting isn't as cringeworthy as I remember. There are cringeworthy moments, but in the context, those moments are intended to be cringeworthy because they're awkward teenagers trying to understand awkward teenager things.
Like the laughing scene.
The laughing scene where they're forcing themselves to laugh. So it's meant to sound awkward. But like Waka has quickly become one of my favorite Final Fantasy characters because he's just delightful and engaging in a way that a lot of other characters aren't. He's very optimistic. He's very forward thinking. He's kind of just trying to do his own thing. Like, you know, there's a ton of drama in 10, but not in the same way that there was drama in 9.
True.
And then, you know, we go to 11, which was an online RPG, which I think is the only dark spot in both of our catalogs, right?
Yeah, I've that is one I've played absolutely none of. Not for lack of interest.
Yeah, for me it was I had no interest in playing a Final Fantasy game on the PC, and the PlayStation 2 version with the online adapter was just so clunky.
It was, and I didn't have a gaming PC at the time.
Right, and so it wasn't a thing I was interested in. So with that, once we got to the PS3, Xbox 360 generation, I was so excited for 13 and so looking forward to it, and having had a fairly good experience with 10, but skipping 9, but sort of liking 8 enough, I thought, oh, next gen Xbox 360, it's not single console anymore. This is going to be great. And I was horribly disappointed by it. And I don't even think it's the game's fault, to be honest. I think
it's not.
The big problem is all the characters were caricatures. The one black character had an afro with a bird who lived in his afro. Like, it just, there was tons of the narrative stuff that rubbed me the wrong way. And I think it's just, it hasn't aged well, but I think if I went back to it, there's nothing wrong with Lightning. Lightning is not that dissimilar from Cloud.
There's a reason why the names match up. There's a lot of things about Lightning that was almost a... The thing I would say counts against her in my eyes is she almost feels like a focus group created protagonist.
Correct.
Because there's a little bit of, let's take the best things from Cloud, the protagonist of Final Fantasy VII, and Squall, the protagonist of Final Fantasy VIII, which is to say they gave her a gunblade.
Right. And, you know, and the narrative, I can't even remember. Gun to my head, I couldn't tell you what the story was about.
I really liked the story. Actually, my experience with Final Fantasy XIII is a little different because I didn't get it when it first came out. I got it after all of the furor about it had already died down. I was able to get the entire trilogy of Final Fantasy XIII for a grand total of about $12 at used game stores. Mm-hmm. So when you spend only $5 on a game, turning it on, you're already getting $5 of entertainment out of it. It's
That's
great.
True.
So Final Fantasy XIII, unfortunately, I painted myself into a corner around Chapter 12, and I'm going to have to start again. I kind of am just in a bad spot before our Tantalus fight. But not for nothing, I enjoyed the game. I enjoy it, and I actually do want to get back into it. It's more a difficulty of attacking the rest of my backlog rather than, I didn't like it. I didn't love it. It's not my favorite, oh my gosh, but I kind of like Final Fantasy XIII.
I mean, I think value comes in a lot. The fact that I was waiting for its release, bought it for $60, $60+, and then popped it in immediately, and like the first 30 hours are linear until it opens up.
Yeah, when I got to that point when I'd always heard that joke, like, no, it's fine, just get through the first 30 hours and it really opens up. I laughed at that as just a sort of like, no, that's a good joke about JRPGs. That's really funny.
Yeah.
And then I actually got to the point that people were talking about, and I was at hour 31. Yeah. I had to put down the controller and like walk away for a couple of minutes because, oh my God, it happened. It was true. And I'm still going to go back and play it again, but it was just kind of, what are we doing in designing these games?
I know, and it's a shame. And I think someday maybe I'll go back to it if they do a re-release along the patterns they're doing. I think they've talked about possibly putting 13 on the Switch. Maybe I'll go back to it. Something we did skip over in the PlayStation 2 generation, though, and we've skipped some stuff. We'll go back or we won't.
We'll touch
see.
on it.
But 10-2, which was a game I wrote off, again, for being a ignorant teenage boy. I was like, ugh, all women, they change outfits, who cares? I was an idiot, because apparently 10-2, which I still haven't played but plan to, is one of the better Final Fantasy games. I've heard that the class system is incredible, the story is really good.
It is.
And so, like, I'm really bummed that being raised in a male-dominated, fairly chauvinistic society influenced me on missing out on some great stuff because I might be viewed as weak or less than, which was very stupid.
Well, how fortunate for us that Square Enix will be re-releasing a good portion of these games till the end of time.
Pretty much. And, like, I'm excited to play those games, but a little overwhelmed as well, because as I was saying earlier, the problem with JRPGs for me at this stage of the game is because my video game time is precious and I don't have a ton of time to play games, taking on something that's 40, 50, 60 hours seems impossible because I feel like I'll never get through it.
It's true.
And so I keep hoping that it's kind of why I'm excited about the old school games being re-released and the fact that we got 7, 9, and we're going to get 8, and we got 10 and 10 too.
With the speed up feature on it.
I mean, it's honestly been really great in 9 if I don't feel like doing random battles to just turn them off. And I get that that's not as intended, but like, if I want to get through this game, I need to play it a way that suits me. And I think that that's really exciting that they have a way to turn off random battles, speed up your movement, max out your levels with the touch of a button. It's all designed so you can experience the story, which is really the main focus of all of these games.
And it's one of the main reasons why it's worth going back. Because, as we said before, Final Fantasy is a series that, for better or for worse, has been about attempts at innovation.
Yeah.
So to go back and re-release those titles, it's warm and fuzzy and nostalgic, and titles that didn't necessarily get a fair shake or much exposure either before Final Fantasy VII happened or what have you, or afterwards, and it wasn't Final Fantasy VII. It allows us to go and re-experience those, but design has changed. Games have changed. Game experiences have changed. And if you really want a classic experience, go buy a PlayStation 1 and a copy of the game. Oddly enough, that's because of all the re-releases, that's an affordable option. But to have a next-gen experience, certain concessions need to be made, and they are optional ones. So they let you play a game of its time period or of, well, your time period.
Yeah, and we've jumped around a bit, but like even going back to Final Fantasy 12, which was the last PlayStation 2 Final Fantasy game and one of the last PlayStation 2 published games, it did a more active battle system. The characters looked more humanoid and realistic, but it's still a fantasy setting with bunny women. Like, it was interesting and again fun, but I couldn't tell you more than the broad strokes of that it's a great war and like these warring factions. And I think one of the problems that I've had with the Final Fantasy series is that sometimes the hype and the story doesn't live up to the experience. It's why I loved watching all of the movies and anime associated with Final Fantasy 15. And then when I played Final Fantasy 15, I was bored.
It's true. Well, something that we were talking about before we recorded this episode that stemmed from a conversation I had recently with a friend of mine talking about all these re-releases is the fact that Final Fantasy VII is such a massive turning point for games, for the Final Fantasy series, that I sort of jokingly said they're not going to re-release Final Fantasy 6 or 5 in the same way that they did these because they're not part of the New Testament. And it really is a schism point of fandom. And a lot of times people will argue over whether 6 or 7 is the best Final Fantasy. And that kind of throws that into sharp focus. It shows that while Final Fantasy 6 and 4, which were released in America under the titles of 3 and 2 respectively, had an ad campaign, it was a very moderate one. It was very modest. It was comparable to other games. One of the reasons why Squaresoft made the Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars was it actually gave Square a bigger foothold in America.
Correct.
It's weird to think about Square needing a bigger foothold in America in a post-FF7 world.
Right.
And Final Fantasy VII kind of was the... You know what? It's kind of appropriate that Final Fantasy VII begins with the train coming into the station because that really started the hype train.
It did, and Final Fantasy VII is still the game that's gotten the most spin-offs or games associated to it, with Crisis Core, which we mentioned earlier, and then Dirge of Cerberus, which was a Vincent Valentine focused game that was a shooter that was terrible.
And before Crisis, the cell phone game that never made it to America that focused on the Turks and the early version of Avalanche about 10 years before Final Fantasy VII.
Like, it's clear that Square Enix also knows that Final Fantasy VII was a turning point for their company.
That's why they're remaking the game.
Right. Of all the games to remake, people would argue that some others others would be more deserving of it, like 9, which was this big fantasy epic that also might fit more in line with modern gaming.
Mm-hmm. It's a pseudo-Shakespearean game with a lot of Shakespeare references within it.
Yeah, but the reason they went back to 7 is because, again, it's a modern pseudo-futuristic setting, and it was the game that changed the view of JRPGs in the States.
Right.
Point blank.
Why make a Cloud-like character for a new game when you can just remake Cloud?
Yeah, and I mean...
Genuinely.
And they've also taken some interesting directions, like, because we mentioned Final Fantasy XI, which didn't really take off. It did okay, but now...
It did very well in Japan.
Right. The reborn version of Final Fantasy XIV, because the original one was atrocious, has gotten a lot of ground, has new expansions coming out, is really popular in the States as well as, in Japan. And with that system existing and them constantly building on that, and that actually being more of a success than previous versions... I think it gives them the freedom to re-inspect and go back. Also, Final Fantasy 15 was such a large undertaking, and at the end of the day, I'm told is very good, and I will go back to eventually.
Same.
It makes sense for them to dip into their past a bit. Also, we live in a world of remakes. We've talked about this many times.
And will again.
But it does really excite me. Like, I made that offhand joke that I've actually heard elsewhere that is not original to me, that we're in a bubble of not spoiling 7 because there are people who are going to be playing this for the first time. My nephew, who I talk to about video games all the time, we talked about E3 when I saw him last. I asked him about Final Fantasy 7 if he's excited for the remake. He said, yeah, it looks really good. You played the original one, right, Uncle Matt? I said, I did. I was like, did you ever play it? He's like, no, I'll probably wait for the remake. That's kind of exciting for me as someone who wants to share that game with my nephew.
Yeah, around, I want to say 6-7 years ago, before the remake was ever announced, and when it was a thing that we all just wished for happening after that tech demo on the PS3, my wife played Final Fantasy VII for the first time. She tried RPGs when she was a kid and didn't much care for them. And was like, okay, Geoff, you love this game. Let's give it a try. Let's play it together. You know this game inside and out. Let's do it. She started playing it, and she knew none of the plot. Yeah. She knew none of the developments. The cake is a lie zeitgeist of Final Fantasy VII completely missed her. So it was so amazing to get to sit with her and watch her experience the game in real time.
Yeah.
And it was a game that made her realize she doesn't dislike RPGs. She doesn't love every RPG, and if it's a smaller cast of characters, she'll really like it. She was like, I don't like Pokemon. Oh, that means I have to choose a team all the time? That's stupid. I was like, well, have you tried Chrono Trigger? She now loves Chrono Trigger. It was a nice gateway. And so it's great that people are getting to experience that, and that it's being set up in a new kind of way so that it fits the modern paradigm, for want of a better term. I kind of wanted to shift this a little bit. I mean, we're talking about like specifics of like all of these games, and you listener may not have played all of these or any of them.
Right.
But something that I really enjoy about Final Fantasy and makes it a very interesting microcosm in this world of remakes and remasters and long-running series of multiple decades. Final Fantasy, as we've mentioned several times, is a series that each numbered entry is a new world, a new cast of characters, a new magic system, a new combat system even. But one of the things that links them together are all of the, I suppose you would say, trappings. For the first 5 Final Fantasies, you always had to deal with elemental crystals.
Yes.
Like, if I ever started a Final Fantasy only podcast, I would name it, and it is always crystals.
Right.
And that held for a while, and even that notion of elemental crystals, or even just crystals, comes up a lot in Final Fantasy. The Final Fantasy 13 trilogy, Saga, it's called the Fabula Nova Crystallis, the saga of the crystals. And you use the Crystarium and Materia and Espers and all of these other things. And there are job classes and types of characters that keep coming back. There are recurrences of certain character names. Like there is a Cid, who is usually a mechanic or airship pilot or both in just about every Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy II. And so you're able to link these things together through subtle or very overt connections, pieces, recurring elements, enemies, weapons, names, characters. Now, Final Fantasy is not the only series that does that. Legend of Zelda pops into mind as a game where you are technically always a different Link, but there is always a Triforce, and there is always a Zelda, and there is always a Ganon. And honestly, they do a Final Fantasy-ish thing while cleaving a little more conservatively because they're all keeping it within the same timeline.
Yeah.
Whereas different Final Fantasy titles, there are oblique references to the ideas that they might be connected. Look up the theories about Final Fantasy X being a massive precursor to Final Fantasy VII if you want to know more.
Right, and this idea that they could be connected if you really squinted, but there's definitely no... Square Enix is not attempting to make any kind of timeline that you can follow. But what's really interesting about that is that the connection pieces are always exciting when you see them, like every time you can train a Chocobo or ride one. Chocobo, whatever you want to call it. Cactars, which are in almost every game, or Tonberries. Like, these are enemies that reoccur or sometimes allies.
Yeah.
It's very interesting how they attempt that, but there's also games, even outside the main number series or sequels of main number series, that have come back. We're getting a remaster of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. Crystals again, which was a GameCube game that was a pseudo hit, where you needed the Game Boy Advance to play the game as a controller because you had a map and other things, and it's being re-released on the Switch, and I'm really excited for it because I loved that game.
It is a very good game.
And that one's more hack and slash action adventure than it is traditional turn-based RPG, and then we mentioned Final Fantasy Tactics before, and I'm someone who's never really been any good at tactics games, but Final Fantasy Tactics is a great tactics game that's made really well, and that people have been clamoring for a sequel for forever, which who knows if we'll ever get.
Well, we sort of did, in a couple of different directions, because there was Final Fantasy Tactics Advance and A2 for the Game Boy Advance and DS respectively.
Right.
Which aren't necessarily direct sequels to Final Fantasy Tactics. They take place within the same world.
Right.
Sort of the exception to this idea that there's new worlds and new places with every game is Ivalice.
Yeah.
Ivalice is the world of Final Fantasy Tactics. Ivalice is created by Yasume Matsuno and has sort of spread out into other Final Fantasy games. In Tactics Advance and A2, you are transported to the world of Ivalice, but it's hundreds of years difference.
Right.
And Final Fantasy 12, Matsuno was a director on it. And so it is part of the Ivalice Alliance.
Yeah.
And is a Ivalice-based game, so a lot of the different races and species of character that show up in Tactics Advance show up in Final Fantasy 12. And that even extends outside of Final Fantasy proper. The sort of underground darling Vagrant story for PS1 is connected to Ivalice because Yasume Matsuno was a director on that, and a lot of the names and elements are ones that were in Final Fantasy Tactics, so we're still connecting it, much in the same way Final Fantasy could just kind of get its, Ultros tentacles into everything, and so it's a distant sequel to those. So, maybe you have played a little bit in the world of Ivalice, but...
Yeah, Final Fantasy as a series is something that, to me, I've also assumed other series are a part of, even though they're not. Like, Chrono Trigger, to me, I always jokingly say, is my favorite Final Fantasy game. Fight me. Because it's effectively Final Fantasy VI. They both came out around the same time. They both have the same kind of animation and some of the exact same sound bites. Like, Kefka's laugh is, of course, in the Funhouse in Chrono Trigger, and then like the humor in both games are very similar as well. You mentioned Ultros, who, is a sentient octopus that tries to kill you multiple times. Yep. Multiple times, to the point where he breaks into a playhouse that has no water to try and kill you.
Yeah, I like Ultros.
And so those games even fit in my canon as well. It's just really interesting the way Final Fantasy's kind of grown in this world. And like, I have a friend who's playing Final Fantasy 12, I think for the first time on the Switch, and is super in love with it. And had not played anything like that before. And I'm just genuinely curious how 7, like if 7 is going to be a second coming of the same kind of cultural event for a different generation. Because if it's the same story writers, I mean, clearly since we're getting it's sort of games as a service. I mean, they're saying it's a complete game. That the Midgar saga, essentially the fact that the whole first part of the game is this release we're getting in March.
And we've already seen elements that they have added to this that were never in the original game that are like, okay, they didn't just pad out that original 5 or 6 hours into 30 hours. There are new pieces, there's new elements, there's sort of... they're rearranging the story a little bit so that I guess this can be its own complete experience.
But that said, like, I wonder how I'll engage with it. Knowing this, you can't turn off your knowledge of a previous experience. It's impossible. And so there's a level of judgment. I was saying to Geoff off air earlier, I am not going to be excited about Final Fantasy VII Remake until I am playing it and enjoying it. Only because... people are raving about the combat system. They're saying it's great. It feels natural. It's a lot of fun. They're raving about the voice acting. They said that they've toned down the Barrett problem. It's still a Barrett problem, but it's not as overt as the original cut of the voice acting.
It feels a little bit like a legacy issue.
And so, I'm really excited to play it, but all the same, I'm like, I'm not sure. Like, I'm really excited about Link's Awakening because I've never played the Game Boy Link's Awakening. So for me, it's going to be a brand new experience. Even though it's a remake, I will have nothing to compare it to, which will make it a completely brand new game for me. Final Fantasy VII Remake, which needs a better name.
It's not getting it. I want it to. It's not getting it.
I know. They called it Resident Evil Remake, so that's what this is. It's just we put remake in titles now.
But some things are remasters and some things are remakes.
No. We're not getting into that again. See a previous episode for that. But, I'm not going to be able to forget the original way the story was told. I'm hoping that the new way they tell it is going to be so exciting that it won't matter. But, like, even when Advent Children... Oh, that's right. Final Fantasy also had films, which we haven't even talked about. Both the overly Americanized Spirits Within, and then the true sequel to Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children.
Yes.
Final Fantasy Advent Children was a direct-to-DVD, although I think it had a limited theater release as well.
It did. It was also one of the big UMD releases for the PSP.
Remember those things? No, nobody does. It's fine.
I'll be over here watching Spider-Man 2 on my PSP.
But that was like, I'd never been that excited for a video game movie. And like when we talked about a few episodes ago, the Detective Pikachu being the first successful video game movie, it's technically not true. Advent Children was, but Advent Children also was not a live action movie.
Right.
And it's animated in a way that makes my brain break a little bit now that I watched the clips for 7 Remake, because it looks like what we only dreamed about and was in Advent Children.
Yeah. And there's also that joke of, when we were talking about 15 in this episode and in previous episodes, how there is that prequel movie that's like, all right, this is the longest opening cutscene to a Final Fantasy game ever. It's so big they didn't even put it on the disc. You have to download it yourself. Advent Children is arguably the most expensive cutscene Final Fantasy has ever sold us.
And yet we ate it the hell up. And
yes.
And still the final battle between Cloud and Sephiroth is phenomenal. Still one of my favorite animated fight scenes I think I've ever seen. But I'm curious where Final Fantasy will go from here, especially since I bounced so hard off of 15, which I know I need to go back to.
Same.
But just the epic scale of like the army battles of that preview movie, Kingsglaive. And the lead character in Kingsglaive was so cool that when you get stuck playing Noctis, who is fairly sniveling in his brief moments in the movie, and even in the opening of the game, it gets better and padded out if you watch the animated stuff, because they spend each episode exploring all of the characters and how they grow separate from each other before you're together. But there's just so much work I had to put into the pre-playing of that game that when I played it, it was almost guaranteed to disappoint. I think in the same way that 13 was so hyped that there was almost no way I was going to like it. And so that's what I'm worried about with 7. And with Final Fantasy in general at this point, is 7 was such a perfect fit for me, and 8 was a perfect enough fit for me, that everything after has sort of disappointed, except for 10.
Well, and 10 was the sort of 7 for people a few years younger than us.
Right.
And I know people even our own age who, depending upon when they got into video games, that same conversation where the New Testament bit came up, one of the people in that conversation, their first Final Fantasy was 10, and they loved it, and it was great.
Right.
And so we all kind of have our jumping on point.
And since then I've gone back and played most of the Nintendo and Super Nintendo games, and they're hit or miss for me. But I think, again, with the future of this series, my biggest concern is that I'm just going to expect another Final Fantasy VII every time, and I'm never going to get that. Even the remake is not going to be that. That said, again, I'm pleasantly surprised with how much I love 9, which makes me inclined to rebuy 8 or finish replaying 10, repurchase 12 since I never finished that, because I feel like maybe I'm also in a different headspace. I mean, I'm also a different kind of gamer now than I was even a decade ago.
Yeah.
Like, I'm finally locking into the fact that I like side-scrolling action games. And that's something that Final Fantasy hasn't really done. Besides the tactics game and, like, Crystal Chronicles, like these selection of offshoots, they've never really jumped into other genres. Because even the tactics game is a tactical RPG.
Right.
Crystal Chronicles is an action RPG.
And there are some phone offshoots. They had a Picross game that I think was Japan only.
And we have the fighting games, the Dissidia series.
Dissidia and Air Guys. Who remembers Air Guys?
I remember Air Guys.
God
it was
bless
the
the
first
ring.
game to have who were playable Cloud, Tifa, and Yuffie were all playable characters in it.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious where their next growth will be, because the fighting game series, which started, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe a little more.
A little more than that. Dissidia, it was on PS Base. Okay. That was like 10 years ago.
Like, no one ever thought they would make a fighting game, and they did. So,
and it worked.
And it worked, and people
like
it.
The PS4 one, that's contentious.
Right.
I'll leave it at that.
But it makes me curious, will we ever get a Final Fantasy stealth game, a side-scrolling action RPG? Like, where will Square Enix adventure next? Because there have been no announcements of 16 yet. Nothing's in the works for 16. The main focus, as I understand it right now, is on the remake, and then there is some kind of original Final Fantasy project in the works that is untitled, unnamed, and unreferred to. It's being worked on.
And, I mean, Final Fantasy, there is a little bit of what's in a name on it, because Final Fantasy 15 began as a Final Fantasy 13 spin-off, Final Fantasy Versus 13.
Right.
And the game that was released as Final Fantasy Type O was another, or Type 0, was another Final Fantasy 13 spin-off game. And as we mentioned already, the Game Boy games were other series called Final Fantasies to sell them. So there's a bit of back and forth that goes on here. Something that I would be really interested in seeing in a Final Fantasy 16 is honestly a step back, because not in terms of design, but in scope. The Final Fantasy series has always been epic, and I mean that in the definition of the word. And however successful or bombastic or how they go about making that epicness has changed as games have changed, as technology has evolved, as expectations have changed. And it's been really cool to get to revisit their older titles in a new context, because it's easy to forget that until 7 happened, they didn't quite have the worldwide hold that they do, and that there have been several games that guarantees that Final Fantasy titles will always be talked about. They may not always be loved when they come out. And so sometimes distance, recontextualization, re-releases allow us to find a way to properly ken the game, I suppose. And Final Fantasy 15 did a nice thing of only a few characters with a very epic storyline and a lot of open worldness and everything else, especially after the criticisms of 13 being too linear.
Right. But I think for me, that goes the opposite direction, as we've discussed. I'm an old man who doesn't have a lot of time to play video games. And so the more concise a story is or a game is, the more likely I am to engage with it. And I've been bouncing hard off of open world games. I have trouble going back to Skyrim. I bounced off of Final Fantasy 15 for that reason. I gave up on The Witcher 3, which was phenomenal, because I just couldn't get through the branching paths, the variety of quests, the open world. And whereas I've been playing a ton of more linear side scrollers because it's a directed experience that I can go through, experience, and move on.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I'm the answer, like that they should make an experience like that. I'm just wondering if my tastes have evolved past playing a Final Fantasy. But that said, I love playing Final Fantasy IX, and I do eventually want to finish it, but it's a game that while I was obsessed with and really hard into the first 20 hours or so, I'm now starting to feel a little bit of fatigue. And again, that's no fault of the game. It's my experience with it. And when I think about it, it makes the episodic is the wrong word because it turns people off. But the way they're making 7 makes sense. If it's tight 30-hour experiences and it's a trilogy, let's say, of 3 games, that might be the perfect way for me to play that at this point.
And that's the way for us to experience the 100-hour RPG epics of the PS1 era that a bunch of curmudgeon-y old men are wistfully nostalgic about, even though they don't have the time for it anymore.
Yeah.
The thing that I keep coming back to in this conversation is the fact that there is a Final Fantasy experience for everyone.
That is true.
And I hope that Square Enix continues to challenge and push forward and go into weird ideas. Maybe we won't see much with the job class system anymore because Final Fantasy XIV gives us that MMO experience of being whatever job class you want, where that started with the first game and expanded. So I suppose one silly question I'd love to ask you is, what is your favorite Final Fantasy job class?
Oh, that's tough. Talking about 7 being my favorite, what was interesting about that is that there were no job classes. For the most part, anyone could be anything. I mean, their limit breaks would define them a little bit. Like Aerith still had buffing and healing limit break.
And their stats sort of push them towards one way or another.
But you could still make Cloud a mage, make Barrett, a healer.
And if you want to break the game, you could get enough source items that raise your stats one by one, and you could turn anybody into a max anything, but that's customization for you.
I don't know. It's tough. You go back to D&D, because Final Fantasy is very heavily based on Dungeons and Dragons. The first game is essentially Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
With the exception that they split the mage into 3 different variants.
Yes.
The black mage, the red mage, and the white mage. White mage healing, black mage damage spells, and red mage kind of a mix and control.
And they evolved on that in later games. The red mage gave you the ability to dual cast.
Right.
So you weren't as powerful, but you had more versatility, which is the idea in the first place.
Right. But I'd say in the original games, my favorite class, which was best represented in 6, was the monk. I love Saban.
Yeah, Sabin. Or however you pronounce it.
I had a great conversation with the nerdcore rapper Word Burglar. He has a song called Input Control, and it is a direct reference to, of course, Sabian's special moves and how you had to do inputs to do them. And he has a lyric in the song about suplexing a phantom train.
Yes.
Which is directly referencing 6.
Yes, he had the blitz command that you would choose, and the arrow would point to Sabin.
Oh, input blitz. That's the name of the song.
And you would put in almost like a fighting game style controller motion, and he eventually had, I believe, 8 different blitzes.
Yeah.
And yes, due to an oversight in programming, he was able to suplex a ghost train.
And so if you want to look up that song, by the way, it's Input Blitz by Word Burglar featuring Megaran, 2 names who are very much well known in the nerdcore community, especially Megaran, who at one point had a campaign from his loyal listeners to get him cast as Barrett in the remake, which didn't happen, but we can dream.
We can dream.
But yeah, I think the monk class has always been my favorite. Fist weapons, close up, but defensive and protections, buffs, that's always kind of been my favorite. And I think Sabian was one of my favorites.
Have you played through all of Final Fantasy Tactics?
I have not.
You should. Monks are amazing in that game. You want to break, that's not the only way to break the game, but it's entry level breaking the game. It's so good.
What would your favorite Final Fantasy job class be?
Blue Mage.
Unsurprising.
It's such an odd form of magic because they expanded on the white, red, and black magic of one. Blue magic is spells learned from monsters.
Right. So it's essentially enemy skill in later games.
Right. Enemy skill materia in Final Fantasy VII was my first introduction to blue magic because I went from 1 to 7. And enemy skill is my favorite piece of materia in Final Fantasy VII, bar none.
Because it's bonkers and the things you can accomplish are nonsensical.
It's so fun. And then all of the other games deal with blue magic in different ways.
Right.
Much like enemy skill, that's one of the classic ways where you have to have the spell cast on the character that can learn blue magic. If they survive it, now they can do it. In Final Fantasy VI, Strago, the blue mage, only had to see the spell being cast. So it was the only reason blindness did anything in that game due to a glitch. If Strago was blinded, he couldn't see it, so he didn't learn anything. Others, you would have to use certain items that were looted off of monsters. So it's almost like eat the monster, become the monster.
Well, yeah, in 9, that's exactly how you learn enemy skills, is you eat them as, I never remember how to pronounce it, Kiona,
Quinoa,
whatever their name is.
Quina. I know it's not quinoa.
And also the only character that I know of that's referred to as S/HE for he, she.
They are they, yeah.
They are they, which I think was really cool. And that they're treated as such, and like no one ever questions it. They just it's just accepted.
And that's absolutely what it is. And Monk is a close second for me. Monk it was my favorite in 1. It's my favorite in Tactics. I keep wanting to make Monk characters work in D&D, and it was a great disappointment to me when I played the 3rd edition D&D for the first time that monks were not as good as they were in Final Fantasy Tactics.
Correct.
And I've been chasing that disappointment for 15 years.
Let's see, what other things? We talked about our favorite Final Fantasy. I think we've pretty much been clear about what our least favorite Final Fantasies have been. Do you have a favorite Final Fantasy hero or villain?
Ooh.
Because I think picking hero and then picking villain is too easy.
Okay. Does it have to be a main character or a playable character?
So let's change it. A favorite Final Fantasy character. It's playable, non-playable. Do you have a favorite Final Fantasy character?
I think I do.
Also, technically, we haven't mentioned them, but the Kingdom Hearts games are sort of part of Final Fantasy as well because the characters appear in them. But that's a whole other can of worms that we're not getting into. So you're saying, though, you do think you have a favorite Final Fantasy character?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about, and this may be because I have a certain set of games on the brain. Honestly, I think Zell from Final Fantasy VIII is one of my favorite characters.
He is one of the cooler characters from that game.
And I really enjoy the fact that Final Fantasy VIII in general, all of the playable characters and even the non-playable characters there's an easy first read of them.
Yeah.
And then the more you get to know them, the more you find out about them, either good or for ill. And Zell is a character that from the beginning comes off almost like he would belong more in Dragon Ball Z or Naruto than in a Final Fantasy game. He's got that hot-blooded anime protagonist kind of attitude.
Yeah.
Which, he's 17 years old. He's allowed to have an attitude.
Even though he looks like he's 30.
That's Final Fantasy design for you. But he's also a character that you can ignore things about him or never take him, but if you bring him with you, you find out all sorts of things. You find out that he actually is a fairly level-headed guy and one of the more well-adjusted emotionally characters of your party.
Yeah.
And has an odd amount of tactical knowledge and mechanical knowledge. You bring him into an old research facility that hasn't been there in a long time, and he's the one that's able to kind of piece things together and get the electricity working again. He's sort of he's not the character that pilots the airship, but if you have that character in your party, he's the next one.
Right.
He pilots the ship. There's a sort of thing of, if you choose to pay attention, he actually is one of the more reliable guys. He has a couple of very emotional mess-ups and things that he's always remembered for. But again, I like monks. I like his limit break, the dual command, where you have a time limit and you just put in all sorts of inputs. And the face tattoo aside, I like his design.
Yeah, except for the face tattoo.
Except for the face tattoo.
Because that's never a good idea.
Look, you know what? They'd given everybody enough spiky hair. They gave him spiky hair, but he couldn't have more anime hair than the main character. Face tattoo.
Right, exactly.
This is the trade-off, and now we understand the conversion rate. It's great.
It's great. It's
great. So, what's yours?
So mine is pretty cliche, but I have to because I grew up a goth boy in the 90s and 2000s. So I think my favorite character in all of Final Fantasy will always continue to be Vincent. And a big part of that also is in Advent Children. He's voiced by Stephen Bloom, a god among voice actors.
Yep.
I'm hoping he's doing the remake, which I have to assume he is.
I like that.
But really the reason I like Vincent is because he's a character that I identify with because there's more to him than meets the eye. He's not just face value. And the fact that he's a character that you could get and then completely skip all of his story. With some minor exceptions, you don't have to find out about his past. Most of it is side quests.
Yeah.
But if you do, you find out he used to be a Turk. He lost the love of his life. He was experimented on. Like,
he's essentially a zombie.
He's essentially a zombie / lycanthrope. And yeah, I've always liked him also because where he has technical knowledge, or where he doesn't talk a lot, but when he does, he has a lot of information and knowledge to share.
Yes, he does.
Also, shotguns.
Oh yeah, no. The playthrough that I did with Sarah all those years ago, there is a materia combination that we discovered and decided to play together. And there's the way you set up the magic system in Final Fantasy VII, you equip the little materia crystals, and there's one called Added Effect. And if you hook it up to something, if you hook it up in your armor, you're defended against the effects, whether it's like Mini or Toad or Berserk or whatever. Or if you put it in your weapon, you then have a chance to do that to the enemy. So there is a materia that teaches you both Mini and Toad. So we hooked that up into Vincent's gun, and we both started cackling like maniacs when we realized we'd given him a shrink gun. And it sometimes turns them into frogs, but we'd shoot somebody and they'd shrink, and we'd just go, shrink gun!
That's great. Yeah, and also I love his design. You know, it's fairly classic for the 90s and 2000s.
It's very Alucard and Helsing.
Very Alucard, both versions of Alucard. It's very Spawn. It's very, in Advent Children, when he attacks, his cloak covers the whole sky and he comes down. It was very much to the aesthetic that I grew up loving in that time period.
Jim Lee Batman.
Pretty much, yeah. And, it's just, I would be lying if I said I loved any character more than him. And I haven't been thinking about him because, again, all of the stuff for the remake is about the Midgar area, which he's not a part of. But I'm getting myself excited because the last time I had a very good graphics Vincent game was Dirge of Cerberus, which was awful. And trust me, I know I tried to beat it, really tried.
I'm proud of you.
Thanks. I think that if they remade it now, they could do a lot better with it. And honestly, a over-the-shoulder shooter or first-person shooter version of Dirge of Cerberus might be really cool.
Yeah, it would.
But that said, yeah, Vincent is definitely my favorite character. The only person, my second favorite would probably be also a Final Fantasy VII character. So, I think that game has more influence in my DNA than I initially thought. But again, Vincent is the strongest one just because of his aesthetic very much fit with the kinds of things I liked at the time that game came out, and it stayed with me.
Yeah, probably a close second would be Baltier from Final Fantasy XII. Because he's basically Han Solo, and we've talked about this. And there's something fun in a game in a series like Final Fantasy where you have a character who speaks of himself as if he's a character in some grand drama.
Yeah.
Because you feel like that's cliche, but we know people who do that in life. So why not have a heroic character who's like, who are you? Well, I'm the hero entering stage right.
Yeah.
Why not?
Actually, I will say, if I had to pick a second favorite character, it would be Vivi. Having played 9 now and going through this, no spoilers, but I'm at a point now where he knows who he is. He's met the other matches. But he's just watching his growth is really impressive because he goes from being a timid, scared character to a brave, defiant character.
He is a fantastic character.
And so he'd definitely be my second favorite.
Now there is a character for everybody. There is a game experience for everybody, and it will continue its spread across all of your gaming experiences. And, no one should play every Final Fantasy game that's out there. Final Fantasy All of the Bravest was a nostalgic, ripping cash grab, and no one should ever play it.
Right.
And those things happen too. Square Enix is not without fault. All of these games have faults with them. It's why they're worth talking about.
Yeah.
If you want to look at a lot of deeper analysis of some of the recurring elements, there's a great YouTube channel, Final Fantasy Union. They did a great series on the concept of the four fiends, which were sort of the four elemental bosses in the first Final Fantasy that have had recurrences throughout the series. They straight up appear as those named characters in Final Fantasy IX, much later in the game. The concept of the four fiends has taken on different aspects throughout the series, and that's just one example of the analysis that they do there, and I highly recommend checking it out.
Yeah. Also, a quick aside to a character we talked about recently, but Kulix, who we mentioned, who's in Super Mario RPG, who's in the style of Final Fantasy boss, has 4 crystals with him. 1 for ice, 1 for fire, 1 for lightning, and 1 for water, I believe. And so, Square Enix is not unaware of their own cliches and are willing to poke fun at it.
And a Nintendo, like, here is like the unrefined raw ore of our experience. Right. Here it is. We would love to hear what some of your favorite Final Fantasies are, whether games, experiences, characters, job classes, motifs, music. This isn't even getting movies. Yeah, because this isn't even getting into the soundtrack of the Final Fantasy games. And Nobuo Uematsu is somebody we should devote an entire episode to.
Yep, we talked about him briefly during our music episode. I fanboyed about the Black Mages, who I still love.
Same.
And there's also tons of Final Fantasy music that's inspired other music. I've mentioned that Mega Ran has a whole Final Fantasy VII album, that Dr. Awkward and Vince Vandal made a Final Fantasy IX song on a recent record. Like, there's tons of stuff that's also inspired by Final Fantasy. But yeah, tell us what your favorite Final Fantasy game is, least favorite, characters you love, don't like, what you like about the series, why you don't like the series. Again, JRPGs are not for everyone, and even as they evolve for a Western audience, and 15 is not turn-based, and even though it's definitely still a JRPG, it's definitely the most Western influenced JRPG that's come out, at least in the Final Fantasy series. There's plenty to love and not love. And so, we didn't talk much about the Dissidia series because neither of us have really played it that much.
I haven't played enough to talk intelligently about it. I've played it. I really enjoy it. I need to play it some more.
Right. But that said, if you love that fighting game series, tell us why. We'd love to know.
Yeah. Also, let us know if you want us to talk more about Final Fantasy or about certain things in depth, or if there's another series you'd like us to talk about. We like having this conversation with you about this series. We want to hear more from you about this.
Yeah, absolutely. If there are certain other game series that you want us to tackle, there are tons of them, and we've alluded to a lot of them. Also, if you want to join the conversation with us, you can go to our Discord, which you can find on certainpov.com, along with a whole plethora of other incredible podcasts.
Yes, this is a conversation. Thank you so much for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming. What we're saying is Final Fantasy is everywhere. It's like how they tried to teach us math when we were kids. If you look around, everybody, math is everywhere. If you look around video games, it's always Final Fantasy. Nothing but Final Fantasy. Bouncing anime boys all day long. Anyway.